Good morning, Ralph. Thank you very much for being here.
Oh, good. Good to be with you.
We're here to talk a little bit about what brought you to USC and what has gone on. This is for the USC archives. We have some questions to ask you about your first impressions of USC, what has changed over time, the kinds of things you did in the USC School of Architecture. As you know, Carol Guston from the Emeritus Center set this up for us. It was awfully nice of her to get us some time in this room to,
sweet lady.
make this. Yes, a very good person. So we start by just doing a background. What brought you to USC? You came here in 1963. What enticed you to come out to Los Angeles and Southern California?
Well, the simplest answer is they offered me a job.
But others offered you a job.
True. But I talked with some very interesting people. Eduardo Catalano, who was my mentor back east, and he said, "Go west, young man. Go west." And I took him at his word. I think his attitude about it was that the West was a place where one could experiment, one could open up and be a little freer of some of the things that were going on in the East. The Eastern schools were, at that time, pretty much dominated by some rather important people, including Louis Kahn, Ian McHard. And out here, there was a kind of a new spirit. It was a kind of opening up of things, of possibilities. The new dean here was a man named Sam Hurst, and he was hiring a number of young people. At the same time, there was a kind of spirit of experimentation in schools of architecture in the country. It was happening here. It was happening in some other places. The profession, I think, was looking for new ideas. So that it seemed like a natural sort of thing for a young architect, a young teacher, to come here and open up possibilities. The school, in addition to having a number of new young faculty, I think was operating in a university that was expanding, that was beginning to, I think, explore possibilities. There was a vice president here, a man named Zorab Kapilian, who was quite brilliant and was beginning to experiment with modes of education, new ideas about interdisciplinary activities of one kind or another. So it was an interesting place to come.
Did you know much about USC and Southern California when you came? I mean, you've heard of the case study architecture movement at the time?
I knew about the case study movement.
There was a little bit of Southern California was making it out?
No, it was architects like Pierre Koenig. And these were young men who were experimenting. They were experimenting with mass production. The so-called case study that was very well publicized around the country. And as a student, I remember seeing the work of Pierre Koenig being studied in the studio. So that there was that aspect of Southern California was not unknown to me.
That's the period when the case study would have been the most heated, right? Then
That's
everybody
right.
was.
That's right. That's right. And besides Pierre Koenig, I think there was an architect named Ed Killingsworth, who was very active, and was very much interested in the School of Architecture at USC. When Sam Hurst became the dean here, Ed Killingsworth became a great ally, and together they formed the Architectural Guild, which became a very important support for the school. The other interesting thing that was happening was that Sam Hurst was interested in how we made connections to the city. It wasn't just what was going on inside the school. He was interested in the social aspects of the growth of the city. He was interested in the urban environment as a kind of background for what we did. And so it seemed natural to think about the program not just as a place to train young architects to make buildings, but to train young architects to make buildings in the urban context, in the context of nature, how nature impacted on buildings and so on. This was a big change in architectural education, because up until that time, in the main, schools of architecture focused almost exclusively on the design of buildings without context.
Right. Individual buildings freestanding in a meadow.
Yeah,
yes.
that's right.
Beautiful, but
yeah, no, beautiful. That's right. But without context, and therefore without meaning. And so that one of the first things we began to look at, and this was encouraged by Hurst, was designing in the urban context, but also designing in the natural context. That led to some very interesting experiments in studio teaching. One of the most interesting ones was the study of nature by simulating nature in the studio as a basis for design. Working with Pierre Koenig and a landscape architect on the faculty named Emmett Wemple, who has done some very interesting things in Southern California. We studied the effect of sun, wind, and water on buildings, on building configurations, on the ways buildings respond to those natural forces. To do that, we invented and built sun machines, wind tunnels, water tables, and the studios became famous across the country for just exactly these kinds of studies. They were seen by the general public as the introduction of science into design.
right. And we still have those sun machines in wind tunnels and still use them.
We
yes.
still use those machines, and it put that program really nationally on the map, and it took us out of that habit of seeing the building as an isolated thing, and seeing it instead as a part of a picture much larger than the building itself.
Now, you were talking about the urban condition and Sam Hurst, and it seems like that comes in strong waves. When I came here 21 years ago, in fact, I think you were the chair of the recruiting committee that brought me here. The master's program in particular, but even throughout the school, had an emphasis on Los Angeles as an urban laboratory, the urban condition, and connecting with the city. So I think we're not doing that as much the last few years, but it seems to come in waves. What was Los Angeles like? You talked about the making a connection to urban context as opposed to buildings freestanding in a meadow.
Right.
The urban context of Los Angeles 1963, there couldn't have been a downtown there because we barely have a downtown there even still now, even though I live downtown. What was LA like? I mean, was USC a suburb?
Surely it was a different place, Doug. It's the tallest building in town was 13 stories. There wasn't anything taller than that. There wasn't anything taller than City Hall. Right. And the population was probably, I don't know, 5 million, 6 million. And incidentally, that's true for USC too. It was much smaller.
Yes.
So the skyline was quite different. Downtown was not nearly as well developed. Century City didn't exist. a city that is a city now, like Glendale, was just a backwoods. So it was quite a different place, and the idea of dealing with some of the social problems from an architectural point of view, therefore, was quite different. There was still a kind of malleability of the city, which continues today, with groups coming in, shifting the boundaries, the social boundaries, and the growth that moved the city generally westward had already begun. Certainly, the post-World War II building boom was in full strength. We were adding suburbs, adding subdivisions at an enormous rate, and I think many of the problems that those subdivisions encountered, like soil erosion, were food for us because we could study them in the laboratory. We could study them on water tables, erosion tables.
Right. I've seen photographs where the students are actually trickling
That's
water over a long time in order to study the patterns of erosion. So that was a result of Los Angeles being sort of an alluvial fan and the water erosion conditions.
A typical kind of exercise was for the students to go out and photograph erosion problems in the landscape, in the actual landscape. Then come in and study them in the laboratory. There were a lot of sort of developing land problems that were occurring and that were good for us to study. I think the problems of tall buildings that we now have had not yet developed. The 13-story limit on building height happened because of a fear of earthquake. But engineering got better, so the buildings went up. And of course, we still have a problem with earthquake. That was another thing that we studied, earth shake tables. How did they impact on buildings and so on? The idea being that unless we understood how those natural forces affected not just a building, but groups of buildings, maybe thousands at a time. Unless the architect understood those problems, the architect was less valuable to society. I think there were some other things that we entered into that took us beyond what architecture schools normally did. We, for example, began to study structures at full scale. How do they fail? Could we design a structural system and test it and apply it in a design? So we took it all the way from the concept of the structure to the testing of the structure to using it to make a building. What was the nature of that structure, and so on. It changed the quality of studio education from a purely tabletop kind of study with T-square and triangle and so on, which had been the way we did things, to a hands-on sort of involvement of the students. The students loved it; they enjoyed it. It gave some life to what they were doing.
Life and underlying meaning, right? Today we might call that performance-based design.
Which is a very important kind of approach to study, and it is today in our building science program that you direct.
And you mentioned you had the shake table, the the wind tunnel. You did the soil erosion tests. You had at one point a team working in studio on sort of a natural forces studio. Tell us more about what that was like.
Well, I mentioned that Pierre Koenig and Emmett Wemple were the other parts of that studio. Pierre took the study of wind and worked with his students to design and build wind tunnels, which were so well done that one of them was bought by our aerospace department here, and they used it for years.
We still have the other one and still use it.
We have one left, and we still use it. Emmett Wemple took the study of water, and I think being a landscape architect, that was a natural for him. Mm-hmm. He did some wonderful studies with the students, devising ways of applying running water to land, to soil of various densities and slopes of varying degrees. Some of these tests ran for days.
I've seen photographs of some of the results. These are fairly large scale.
Right, and they were so big, as a matter of fact, that we did them outside.
Right.
And Emmett and his students devised a tower with a movie camera, stop motion movie camera on it, that took a shot, took an exposure every so many minutes.
Yeah.
And what we got for that was, of course, an animation of these and the dynamics of the water flow. Yeah. Some of these things ran for so long. We ran them 24 hours a day, and there were people there 24 hours a day, that they got famous on the campus. People would come by at 2 o'clock in the morning and sit there and watch these things work.
Well, you were on the, at that time, Watt Hall wasn't there, and so at that time, the School of Architecture was almost the edge of campus.
That's
so
right.
The neighborhood you were right up against.
That's right.
The city.
That's right. And as a matter of fact, some of our classes were held in World War II barracks, mm-hmm. that were on the site that is now Watt Hall. Mm-hmm. But it was wonderful to watch people get involved. There were people coming from the School of Engineering. There were people coming from cinema. There were people coming from everywhere just to watch these things work and erode. Some of them lasted so long that they began to bear fruit. They began to grow things because there were seeds, natural seeds in the soil. And along the water flow, you'd get a growth of something. And somebody said, was watching it one night and said, "I'm expecting dinosaurs to come next." So these were very sort of seductive things going on. They were fun to watch and fun to be around. That was true also for full-scale structural studies, and that tradition of full-scale structural studies has continued. There was a space frame built over the space between Watt Hall and Harris Hall.
That lasted until the mid-90s. That was here when I came.
Yeah, yeah.
You talked about the importance of the urban condition in Los Angeles, but you've also participated with the city in some of the political things. You were advising the Community Redevelopment Agency and the City Council at the time. Can you talk a little bit about the projects you did with those groups in the 60s?
Yeah. One of the studies that the school, as a matter of fact, became famous for was a study of zoning strategies for assuring solar access.
Yes.
There are two reasons for that. One is daylighting, especially among tall buildings. The other is direct access to the sun for energy conversion. And because we were interested always in seeding projects in the city itself, We contacted members of the city council. We contacted the community redevelopment agency, and couched our projects in terms of things that were going on in their districts.
Right.
Especially housing. The first of those projects was done for the community redevelopment agency.
Mm-hmm.
And it was about the redevelopment of Bunker Hill. At the time, the Community Redevelopment Agency was holding a competition among 4 architect-developer teams. And they were interested in, the agency was interested in the impact of the development on Bunker Hill from a solar point of view, because there was a sensitive surround. There was housing for the elderly,
Mm-hmm.
and the agency was interested in what buildings development on the site, how it would impact on the housing for the elderly, how it would impact on other kind of housing in the area, open space, and so on. And they asked us to do a study of solar access. And we did that study for them as a class project, and they used the results of that as a basis for evaluating the projects that were presented by the architect-developer teams. And in fact, at that time, did use our studies as a basis for selecting a winner.
Mm-hmm.
Now that was a long time before the actual construction started.
Right, but Bunker Hill had already been erased, right? There were federal funds.
It had
that
already been erased.
All the Victorians,
That's right.
all the sort of rundown buildings had been erased, so there were blocks and blocks downtown, the north end of downtown, that were just completely empty. So
That's
it would
right.
have been clearly an important focus of the
It was a
the
very
CRA.
important focus.
Even if it took them, 30 years or more to actually get around to accomplishing more than just a few pieces.
Well, that's a lesson in itself, and I think it's a worthy lesson that when you deal in projects that large, you don't build these things overnight. You don't build them in a day or a week or a month or a year. It takes decades, which it did. And over decades, things change, conditions change. But we played an important role in the initial formation of this project. We did housing studies for members of the city council in west of downtown. We did studies for a private developer, who was developing at the time another hill just to the west of downtown. It was adjacent to the place where the old red line went underground into downtown. So these were projects that had political implications. They had development implications. They had land planning implications, and they were done always for a client that was a public client or a private client. So, as a kind of context in which students could work and design and study, it was invaluable. Our students were contributing to society while they were still in school. And this became, I think, quite a challenge for them. They realized the value of what they were doing was much more than just doing a project in school.
Yeah.
It was doing a project in school that had implications and use for what was going on in the city of Los Angeles. And fortunately, the city of Los Angeles was under rapid development. So there were projects to work on.
The Bunker Hill area went through rapid development in parts, but parts of it I lied a moment ago. I said 30 years later. It's actually it's now 50,
Yeah.
and there are still blank
Yeah.
sites.
Yeah.
As we're
Yeah.
talking today, the Broad Museum, I don't know what they're going to call it, maybe just the Broad, is halfway under construction, and there's
Right.
the Architectonica housing will be right next to it, and the Frank Gehry housing, the
Right.
tower was proposed. I don't know if it's going to go, but those sites have been effectively empty
Right.
since you came to USC
That's right.
50 years ago.
That's right.
And started teaching. So hopefully in the next few years it'll
Well,
start to pick
that's
up.
but that's a good in a way. I think over the years things do change, and the program would change. It's important that maybe that the thing does not move any faster than that, because we learn along the way.
You've talked with me in the past, and you mentioned it a little bit before with the shift in the studio, that you were here just when Sam Hurst and you and Pierre and Emmett and others were shifting away from the sort of building type
Right.
studio structure, right, where you say, this studio this semester we're going to do a school, into other issues, urban issues, natural forces issues. Were there other things that created a change in the design studio system?
We very early on attempted to develop ways to simulate the experience of walking through a building or walking through a landscape.
All of this pre-computers, right?
All pre-computers. We set up multiple cameras and photographed a space or a landscape, and then set up a multiple screen system and projected onto the multiple screens and stood inside. As we simulated movement, the imagery around us.
And this is all film,
changed.
8 millimeter or?
Yeah, and it was. I mean, this was such a novel thing to do, but we were interested in how we actually responded to space. I mean, architects have talked about space for a long time, but what is space? It's actually an experience. It isn't a thing. It's our experience of a thing, and we experience architecture in one of two ways. We either move and the environment changes around us, or we sit perfectly still and the environment changes around us. For example, the sun comes into your window, and a little while later, the sun has moved. How does that affect how we behave? How does it affect the building thermally? And so on. These are questions that had not been asked in architecture. I mean, we were interested in the building type. We had models for the building type. We made diagrams of the building type, and over time, we started with little buildings and got to bigger buildings and still bigger buildings. Finally, we were at airports and hospitals and so on. But the idea that one could simulate being in this space, being in these buildings, or simulate the impact of the environment on these buildings, that was just not done. So in doing those things, we essentially changed the nature of studio education in architecture. I think there's an aspect of the city that is interesting from the university's point of view. There was a time when the university was trying to decide whether to stay on its present site.
Yes, that was a big issue.
At the time, a few years before that, I had studied, I had been working with a project that looked at the development of the transportation net of Los Angeles. and trying to understand it as a predictive tool about where development will occur in the future. We had not quite finished that study when Jack Hubbard, who was the president at the time, called me. I was in the Rocky Mountains, and I was working on a book. And
this is the Sun Rhythm Forum?
It was Energy and Form.
Energy and Form.
And I was working hard, and my family was there, my wife and my children, and I was writing every day. Anyway, Jack Hubbard called and said, Sam Hurst has retired from the deanship, and would you become the dean? I thought, I don't know what I thought. It was a shock, and I thought, what can be done if I become the dean? and I thought, well, you know, some things could be done if you were the dean rather than a professor. So I said, okay, I'm not going to be the permanent dean, but I'll be an interim dean until you find a new dean. As the interim dean, I was able to do some things, and one of the things I was able to do was to put my study into a presentable form. And I was asked by Zorab Kaprilyan, who was the executive vice president, to present this study to the Board of Trustees at the Board of Trustees retreat. This must have been 1973. And I used the study as an argument for keeping the campus exactly where it is, quite close to downtown.
Right.
Downtown was developing very quickly. It hadn't reached its present maturity, but it was developing quickly. And it looked to us in our study as if the proximity to downtown was exactly where USC should be, because there was a lot of discussion, a lot of pressure, really, to move it further west.
Mm-hmm.
I will never know the extent to which that presentation affected the decision. Maybe not very much, maybe some. But the decision was made to leave the campus where it is. I think that was a very smart decision.
The benefit of hindsight, it's certainly we're in the right place.
Very smart
Downtown's
decision.
gotten a little bit closer to us. We've had, I think, a powerful and positive impact on the region. I'm not sure what being over on the west side.
Well, you know,
more land, perhaps.
It allowed quite a direct connection to downtown. You live downtown and teach here, and work here, and direct the building science program here. So, and you're not the only one living down there and teaching here.
There are a number of us in the School of Architecture that occasionally forget where our cars are parked because the system has actually matured so much. It's been a while, but you know, the various buses and the rail line just opened a few months ago. Now it's pretty magical to live downtown.
I think it's important for another reason. Faculty who can live downtown and work here, teach here, do their research here, direct programs here, can't really lose track of the fact that they are living in this city.
Right.
It's an important kind of connection. It's I would think it would be a terrible thing for our faculty. Let's say we could find housing out somewhere in the suburbs and out in the countryside for our faculty. I think it'd be terrible for them to be living out there and working here. They would lose that connection to the city.
I think they lose the connection. I think they also lose the sort of opportunities that happen when faculty are just in the building. We have a number of faculty who are, because they're close by, we just work in the building.
Right.
And so accidental lunches. I think USC, maybe in the 60s it was a bit of a commuter school. I know in the 70s and early 80s, it was very much faculty, students, staff, everyone drove here from some distance and then went
Right.
away.
Right.
And it's just not that way anymore. It's there are
right.
things going on in the evenings.
That's
There are
right.
people here essentially all the time. You can come in the morning. The parking lots fill up.
Yeah.
The commuters
Yeah.
come and stay all day. So I think that's that's a pretty big difference. Did you want to talk about the fifth year? You told me before about Crombie Taylor.
When I came here, it was a school of architecture and fine arts. Crombie Taylor, who came from the School of Design in the Chicago School of Design, was the Associate Dean of Architecture, and a man named Grant Manson, who had been at I've forgotten where he came from, but it was Harvard or someplace east. Was the dean of the Associate Dean of Fine Arts. The School of Architecture and what is now the School of Fine Arts have had an interesting sort of history. There have been pressures to pull them apart sometimes, and there have been pressures to put them together at some times. The pressure to put them to keep them together was brought by Sam Hurst, who was using as a kind of model the Bauhaus in Germany.
Right.
The Bauhaus put architecture, industrial design, art all together. And these different fields fed each other. That was Sam's dream.
We even had an industrial design program
And we had
at that time.
and we had an industrial design program. We had we did not have landscape, but we had Emmett Wemple on the faculty,
Right.
who was a landscaper. We did not have building science at the time, but we had very shortly after Sam Hurst came, he hired Conrad Wachsmann, who came from Europe. He was the architect for the house of
Einstein.
Albert Einstein.
Yeah.
And he described sitting out in the middle of a lake in a rowboat with Albert Einstein hanging his feet over the end of the boat in the cool water. And anyway, Conrad gained part of his fame by designing Einstein's house, but his major thrust was industrialization of housing.
Right. He was making big panels, and he was always fascinated with sort of universal connectors.
Universal connector.
That was the thing. The General Panel Corporation, I think, was a big thing for a while. It's a shame he passed away.
It was, and in fact, he established the Panel Corporation here in Los Angeles.
Right.
But he began the Building Institute.
Yeah.
And that became an advanced study program. And he sort of set the tone for the study of building from a scientific point of view.
Well, he had the advantage that he was doing that, and we don't make it seem like he had you and he had Pierre. He had a whole group at the time there in the mid-'60s who all had the sort of building science, natural forces emphasis, and so I think maybe it was a little bit easier to argue. That's a good foundation to argue to keep going with the building technologies.
And that in combination with the natural forces laboratory that grew out of the studio that I was describing to you. And I think that the impetus toward building science just kept growing and getting stronger and stronger. And as you have taken on the doctoral program in building science, I think that program has achieved enormous strength in the school itself.
You talked a little briefly about the School of Architecture and the School of Fine Arts, things that led to them growing further apart and closer together. There was a committee at one time to talk about interdisciplinary activities and even gerontology. What was your role in that?
When I was the interim dean, I was put in charge of a committee to study the feasibility of interdisciplinary activity in the campus, and that committee was invented by Zohrab Kaprilyan, and he asked me if I would do a study of gerontology as a model for interdisciplinary activities, and we did that study. Gerontology turned out to be a very good model for interdisciplinary activity. Their faculty or their staff came from a lot of different schools, architecture, and medicine,
Social work there from
social
everywhere.
work, and so on.
It's kind of a unique.
This was a unique kind of effort, and that was one of the activities that was being built and developed. Another was the Institute of Urban Ecology. Now this was a really grand sort of idea and exploration, looking at the city as a kind of living organism, something that had pulse, that had life, that had being. And it involved designers, urban designers, it involved planners, it involved social workers, real estate people, all working together, all interacting. That kind of model was something that interested Zohrab Kaprilyan very, very much, and he saw it as certainly a powerful aspect of a university. Those activities have continued. They've evolved. They've changed as markets change, as the social structure of the city changes, and so on. So that some of them are still functioning very much, I think, as they were originally intended to function. Some of them have morphed into other kinds of activities and other kinds of emphases. But that was a kind of study that I think was very useful to do, and I was able to do that as the dean, as the interim dean. The other thing that came out of that was I was able to make a link between fine arts and the Getty Villa. There, we made a joint appointment with one of their important people there, who was the curator of antiquities, who came here to teach, took our students out there, our fine arts students out there, exposed them to the antiquities, sometimes in frightening ways. He would open a glass case and take out an object that was probably 3,000 years old and hand it to somebody. And I can tell you that our students came back immensely impressed. So it was a great plus for us to have that kind of interaction with an important institution.
I think the connection to the Getty, since that time they built the new Getty on the top of the hill,
Getty,
and the
Getty Center.
The emphasis has changed for our relationship. We work with them on the Getty Conservation Institute with the research center with material sciences and those kinds of things. I think reflecting again what you did with Pierre and Konrad Wachsmann, making the building sciences important. This is now about sort of material sciences.
Right.
I don't think they hand us 3,000-year-old objects anymore, but we do try to dissolve things
doubt
with
it.
acid rain and learn about the effects of things on the sides of buildings. The Getty is very good at
I often
those
wondered
kinds of things.
what Mr. Getty would have thought of what that man was doing.
Several weeks ago, we talked a little bit about the USC community, and you told me about Levi Johnson, a name I hadn't heard until you
Yeah.
talked to me. Tell me about the community. You were a part of a USC committee and liaisons with the
Right.
community.
Liaisons with the community. It was Levi Johnson was a social worker in the community, very much interested in the relationship between USC and the community.
Still an important issue.
And still an important issue. I think very often universities are not wonderful neighbors in a community. They operate in a different rhythm. And the community has people who live and work and recreate in the community year-round. Universities tend to impact on the community in ways that are a little bit strange to the basic rhythms of life of the community. A football team, a game, well, for example, will have a tremendous instantaneous impact on the community, and then then it goes away, and a few weeks later it comes back again and impacts. So this is a bit difficult for a community to adapt to, and I think what we were trying to do was to become cognizant of that kind of thing, and the sort of mismatch that the university can sometimes impose on a community. Levi was very interested in that. At the time, University Village was being developed, and that was bound to have a major impact on the community. So I got to know Levi quite well because he would come as a guest at our committee, and we would try to talk these things through. And it was Levi would raise a concern. We would talk it through. He would come back a week or so later. We would talk through another kind of issue. One of the big problems that he saw, and that has a kind of inevitability about it, and that's the spatial separation of the university from the community by traffic circulation. When I first came here, Vermont was just a standard street on the west. And the streets surrounding what now are the major traffic carriers around USC were just normal streets. The community could easily walk onto the campus. Community children rode their bikes on and off the campus, did their papa wheelies on the campus, and so on. So there was a kind of a close fit going on. As the university has had to develop, with schools getting larger, buildings filling in the empty places, and so on, the issue of separation becomes more intense. So it behooves us, faculty and the university administration, to try to understand things not just from our point of view, which we have to do, but also from the community's point of view. And that's what that committee was set up to do. It was, again, an invention of Zoran Kapelian. And he was, if I look back on the growth of the university over many years, I see him as a major driving force. a kind of not just a superb dean of engineering, which he was, and an executive vice president, which he was, but also as a kind of person who cared very much about the role of the university in the community and the role of the community in the university. And I think that was terribly important, and it gave a kind of conscience to the university that maybe not all universities have. I think it's a there are a number of reasons to be proud of the development of USC. That's one that relates to what's going on outside. I think I've seen development within the university that presents some real reasons to be proud too. Yeah. When I came here, it was, as you pointed out, a kind of commuter school. People drove in, and then they drove out at night. What has happened, I think, partly because of the development around us that accommodates students and faculty, something else has happened that is a major change in the quality and character of the university, and that's the development of our research wing.
Yes.
It was not, when I came here, a major research institution. It has become a major research institution, making contributions across the country and around the world. Another thing that I think has happened is our link to other countries. We have many students now coming from China, from India.
I think for many years in a row, USC has been the most diverse university in
for
the
a
country
long time.
In terms of the number of students coming from really everywhere.
But it's happening to a much greater degree now.
Yes.
I mean, when I came here, the School of Architecture had about 250 students in it. Virtually all of them male. We now have in excess of 700.
Right. And we were big at 250. In those days, that was a big school.
That was big school.
So 750 is an impressive.
But I would guess probably at least half of them aren't now women.
We're slightly more than half in the incoming freshman class for the last 10 or 12 years or so.
So that's, I think that that's a fundamental kind of change in the nature of the university. How we now staff the university, the fact that we have a kind of involvement of women students that I see as very, very positive.
The student body has certainly transformed. We still have some distance to go with, the faculty change has been very, very slow. In part just because it's been a long time since we've been in a hiring spree. I think after I was hired here in '91, I think we went 15 years or so before we hired anybody again. So there was a big gap there. Before we run out of time, there is one thing I wanted to talk with you about. It's research related, and it has to do with why I had heard of you 15 years or so before I actually met you. When I was a student as an undergraduate, I had to learn about a thing called the solar envelope and solar access, and read a wonderful book about the importance of daylight and sunlight. At the time, I didn't realize that people who wrote books were actually people. I had no idea that there was a person behind this. That was just the name on the cover. But certainly, you were well known to everyone in architecture as a name on a book. Solar access zoning and the solar envelope have been very, very important, but some of the people watching this aren't going to know what that is. Could you talk about the solar envelope and the importance of solar access before we conclude?
Well, of course, the context for that is our energy problems. In the 70s, it was pretty clear that oil supply was going to be a problem for us. We were getting our oil to a great extent from the Middle East, and we had something called the energy crisis. Where people were lined up for gasoline and being very unhappy about it. It became pretty clear that we needed to look for alternative sources of energy, whether those were wind or water or sun or nuclear. I was very interested in the sun as a source of energy. I think it came out of my interest in natural forces and the impact of them. I began a little study, just a tiny little study, of our legal right to sun. I mean, if you're going to use the sun as a source of energy, obviously you have to have, you can't have other things in the way. You can't have big buildings in the way. And the question became how to develop a zoning tool that would control the relationship or relationships among buildings so that solar access was guaranteed to everybody. It became a kind of dream, and this little study that I put together was about how you could do this legally. I began to work with attorneys at the Building Research Institute in Golden, Colorado. And they were also working on the same problem, but from a legal point of view. I wanted to work on it from an architectural point of view. Mm-hmm. These attorneys who were publishing and interested in the subject finally concluded that the best way to assure solar access was through a straightforward application of zoning. Zoning is that body of law that every city has that is as close to the user, as close to people as any body of law. They can raise questions about it. They can bring lawsuits about it, and it is a very straightforward way to control heights, to control setbacks, and so on. It seemed logical to look at zoning as a way to guarantee solar access. But instead of arbitrary setbacks or building height applications, using the geometry of the sun to establish the external boundaries on what you could build. That's what we set out to do. By looking at how the sun moves and using it to establish boundaries on construction, we developed this concept of the solar envelope. The solar envelope became the zoning tool. Since then, it has become a model for solar access in other countries. It's not always used as we developed it, but in its principle, it's used in a lot of countries around the world now. It's used in Israel. It's used in many cities in Germany. In some form, it's used in a number of cities in this country. So to insist that it be used in its absolute configuration is a kind of silly thing. But the concept, the idea, the principle is pretty well established now.
I think everybody grasps the underlying idea of the access to daylight, and well, how did he get to build a building that blocked my sunlight, it blocked my energy, it blocked my quality of life. Having
right.
a real tool, I think certainly one of the most important developments in architectural, in sort of architecture and zoning in the 60s, and while people probably haven't heard of it, people who will be watching this later may not know about what that thing is. I think it has a profound impact on the way cities are going to be developed in the future.
I think it's beginning.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's beginning. It takes societies a long time to sort of adjust to ideas.
That brings us back around where we got started. It was 50 years from when you arrived to about now,
right.
and they're starting to make buildings on Bunker Hill again after a 50-year circle. But
That's right.
I'm certain that the solar access and solar envelope work will continue to be very, very important.
Well, we'll see.
Professor, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much for talking with us today.
It's good to talk with you, Doug.
Thank you, sir.
Right there.
We'll see you again.